The desperate decision. Emma Chen stood in front of the full-length mirror of her Manhattan apartment, her hands smoothing down the emerald silk dress that hugged her body perfectly. The city lights glowed through the tall windows behind her, but she barely noticed. Tonight wasn't about beauty or romance. Tonight was about survival, her career, her future, everything she had worked for since she was a teenager. At 29, Emma was already the marketing director at Pinnacle Advertising, one of New York's most respected firms. But she knew titles meant nothing if she failed tonight. The annual charity gala was more than a social event. It was where partnerships were born, deals were signed, and reputations were sealed. Her boss, Richard Hampton, had made it painfully clear. Emma, the Hartwell Foundation, is considering a multi-million-dollar campaign. Impress them. Don't let me down. Emma sighed, lowering her phone onto the dresser. She had no family name to protect her, no rich connections waiting to open doors. Everything she had earned came from endless nights, missed birthdays, and a heart she had locked away so she could climb higher. But Richard's unspoken message had been obvious. She couldn't walk in alone. She needed someone by her side, a charming, sophisticated date who would make her look powerful, desirable, untouchable. That was the problem. Her love life was a disaster. The last man she dated left when he realized her career would always come first. And in the 6 months since, her phone had been silent. Work didn't leave space for romance. So 3 days ago, in a moment of desperation, Emma did something reckless. Something she never thought she would do. She booked an escort. Her stomach twisted even now as she thought of it. The agency promised absolute discretion. No scandals, no risks. Just someone presentable, someone who could make her Lewis. They could complete. For one night, that was all. Emma glanced at the clock. Almost 7. He would arrive any minute. Her heart pounded as she adjusted her earrings and smoothed her hair. She hated that she had to do this, but this night could change her future forever. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Emma froze. For a moment she thought about canceling, pretending no one was home, but her feet carried her to the door anyway. Slowly, she turned the handle. The man who stood there wasn't what she expected, not even close. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her, he wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. No cheap charm, no practiced smile, just quiet confidence, powerful, dangerous. For a split second, Emma forgot to breathe. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Miss Chen?" he asked smoothly. Emma's pulse raced. Something about him felt wrong. This was no escort. He looked like a man who belonged on the cover of Forbes magazine, not in some secret agency's roster. And she had no idea that this one desperate choice, the knock on her door, was about to change her life forever. The stranger at the door. For a long moment, Emma stood frozen at the threshold, her hand gripping the polished brass handle of the door as if letting go would make her collapse. She had prepared herself for someone ordinary, maybe a man who looked sharp in a rented suit, someone with a polite smile, someone who could play the part of a charming date for a few hours. That was what she had paid for. But the man in front of her was nothing like that. His presence filled the hallway, not just because of his height, but because of the quiet authority he carried. The tuxedo wasn't just well-fitted, it looked like it had been crafted for him alone. His shoes gleamed, his cufflinks sparkled subtly in the soft light, and his watch was the kind you didn't just buy. You earned it, or inherited it from a dynasty. Emma felt her mouth go dry. Escorts weren't supposed to look like this. He met her gaze without hesitation, as though he were used to being studied, judged, even admired. His blue eyes held hers steadily, and for the first time in years, Emma felt a sharp wave of nervousness crash through her. She cleared her throat and stepped aside, forcing herself to move before she made a fool of herself. "Please, come in," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and stepped inside, his footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, as if his presence alone had shifted the energy of the space. Emma closed the door behind him, her thoughts racing. Something about him didn't add up. The agency's website had promised discretion and professionalism, but it hadn't prepared her for someone who looked like this. He didn't glance around nervously like she had imagined an escort might. Instead, he walked with ease, his posture relaxed yet commanding, like a man who had stood in boardrooms and on stages, like a man who had nothing to prove because he already owned the room, any room. Emma tried to push the thought away, reminding herself that tonight wasn't about him. Tonight was about her career, her chance, her future. Still, curiosity pricked at her. She turned toward him, her emerald dress catching the soft glow of the lamp, and managed a polite smile. "I appreciate you being here tonight. It's important to me." She expected him to respond with something rehearsed, maybe a flirtatious compliment, maybe a line he had repeated 100 times for women who needed company. Instead, he simply studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful rather than predatory, before replying in a low, even tone. "Important nights deserve the right company." The words shouldn't have unsettled her, but they did. Emma's brow furrowed slightly as she moved toward the mirror, pretending to adjust her earrings while she stole another glance at him. Who was this man really? His confidence wasn't forced, and it wasn't the smooth act of someone who was paid to impress. It was real, the kind of confidence born from power and wealth, the kind she had only ever seen in her clients, the kind that made entire rooms go silent when certain people entered. She felt the faintest shiver of doubt. Had the agency made a mistake? Or worse, had she made one by inviting him here? "Shall we?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence, his voice calm but edged with something she couldn't place. Emma turned back to him, her hand clutching her small clutch purse a little too tightly. She wanted to ask him questions, wanted to demand to know why he seemed so different, but the clock on the wall reminded her she had no time. The gala was waiting, and hesitation could cost her everything. Forcing her thoughts into order, she nodded quickly. "Yes, let's go." Together they stepped into the night, the city alive with lights and noise. Emma walked beside him, her heels clicking against the pavement, her mind torn between focus and suspicion. She told herself that she had made this arrangement for appearances only, nothing more. But deep inside, she felt the truth pressing against her nerves. Whoever this man was, he was no ordinary escort. And tonight, she was about to find out just how dangerous it was to underestimate a stranger. Whispers at the gala. The black sedan slid smoothly to a stop in front of the Grand Hotel ballroom where the Hartwell Foundation's annual charity gala was already in full swing. Spotlights stretched into the night sky, photographers crowded the entrance, and a sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits swept through the revolving doors. Emma sat stiffly in the back seat, clutching her clutch purse like it was a lifeline. Beside her, the man she still knew only as Daniel, that was the name listed on the agency's confirmation email, looked utterly unfazed. He leaned back comfortably, one hand resting lightly on his knee, the other adjusting his cufflinks with the kind of precision that belonged more to a CEO than to an escort. As the driver opened her door, Emma stepped out carefully, the cool night air brushing against her bare shoulders. The flashes of cameras startled her for a moment, though she quickly realized they weren't aimed at her. They were aimed at everyone who walked this carpet because for New York society, this wasn't just a charity event. It was a battlefield. Reputation, influence, and wealth were the weapons, and everyone here had come to win something. Emma took a steadying breath and glanced at Daniel. He was already at her side, his hand extending naturally, effortlessly, as though he had escorted women like her into ballrooms 1,000 times before. She placed her fingers at his ends, ainced his palm, and a strange current ran through her, equal parts reassurance and unease. Inside, the grand ballroom was a spectacle of elegance. Crystal chandeliers glistened overhead, long tables covered in ivory linens lined the edges, and the air buzzed with laughter, music, and the subtle clinking of champagne glasses. Emma's boss, Richard Hampton, was already across the room, shaking hands with a cluster of men in tailored suits. Emma knew she had only minutes to compose herself, to step into the crowd as though she belonged. She had prepared her talking points, her charm, her poise. What she hadn't prepared for was the way Daniel seemed to command attention without trying. They had barely taken 10 steps into the room when Emma noticed heads turning. Not toward her, though she knew she looked striking in her emerald silk dress, but toward him. People whispered behind raised hands, eyes flicking toward Daniel with something between surprise and recognition. A pair of older men near the bar paused mid-conversation, their expressions tightening as if they had just seen a ghost. Even one of the waiters slowed his steps, nearly spilling a tray of champagne, before recovering with wide eyes fixed on the man at her side. Emma's stomach knotted. This was not how it was supposed to go. An escort was supposed to blend in to make her look polished without drawing attention away from her. But Daniel was doing the opposite, drawing stares, sparking whispers, unsettling the rhythm of the room just by existing. She forced herself to smile politely as a colleague approached, complimenting her gown, but she couldn't ignore the way his eyes darted nervously to Daniel before excusing himself in a hurry. "Is everything all right?" Emma whispered sharply once they found a quiet corner, her voice low but edged with tension. Daniel's expression remained unreadable, his gaze sweeping the room slowly, deliberately, like a man scanning a chessboard before his first move. He finally turned back to her, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. "Everything's fine. They're just curious." Emma's heart raced. Curious? No. This was something more. This was recognition. Whoever Daniel really was, he was not the anonymous companion she thought she had hired. She opened her mouth to press him, to demand an explanation, but before she could, Richard Hampton's booming voice cut through the music. "Emma, there you are." Her boss approached with his usual air of confidence, but even Richard, who rarely allowed anything to shake him, hesitated for half a beat when his eyes landed on Daniel. His smile flickered before returning tighter this time, as though he had just stepped onto dangerous ground. He extended a hand, his words careful. "And who is this friend of yours?" Emma's pulse hammered in her ears. She hadn't prepared a story, hadn't rehearsed a name beyond the one the agency had given. She opened her mouth to answer, but Daniel moved first. He shook Richard's hand firmly, his eyes steady, his tone smooth, yet carrying a weight that silenced the air around them. "Just here for the evening," he said simply. It was vague, it was perfect, and it was maddening. Richard studied him for a moment longer, clearly unsettled, before turning back to Emma with a forced laugh. "Well, let's make sure you both enjoy yourselves tonight. The Hartwells are already here." He walked ahead, leaving Emma standing in a swirl of panic and suspicion. She turned to Daniel, her voice low but urgent. "Who are you, really?" But the only answer she received was that same unreadable smile, the kind that hid more than it revealed. And as the music swelled and the gala unfolded around them, Emma realized the most dangerous part of the night wasn't impressing the Hartwells or securing her future. It was discovering the truth about the man standing at her side. The man who owned the room. The Hartwell Gala had always been a carefully choreographed event, every detail designed to impress New York's most powerful philanthropists and corporate leaders. But as Emma followed her boss through the glittering crowd, she sensed that tonight the script was beginning to unravel. Conversations dimmed when Daniel passed, laughter softened into murmurs, and eyes followed him as though drawn by gravity. It wasn't just recognition, though Emma could see it in the widening eyes of men and women alike. It was respect mixed with a hint of unease, the kind reserved for someone whose decisions could shift fortunes with a single word. Emma's heart pounded harder with each step, her mind torn between panic and disbelief. Had she accidentally invited someone dangerous into her life? Or worse, someone untouchable? Richard Hampton stopped before the Hartwells, his confident smile returning as he extended greetings to the elegant couple who held the fate of Pinnacle Advertising in their hands. Emma straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to slip into her polished professional persona. She had practiced this moment endlessly, the charm, the poise, the subtle balance of confidence without arrogance. But before she could even begin her carefully rehearsed introduction, Daniel stepped forward. With the same quiet authority he had carried all evening, he extended his hand to Mr. Hartwell first. The older man blinked in surprise, his expression shifting from polite detachment to something sharper, almost reverent. "Well," Mr. Hartwell said after a pause, his voice carrying a note of shock. "This is you unexpected." He glanced at his wife, who offered a smile tinged with curiosity before returning his attention to Daniel. "It's been some time." Emma's breath caught in her throat, Some time? That wasn't the reaction of a stranger meeting an escort for the first time. That was recognition, personal, direct, undeniable. She felt Richard stiffen beside her, his smile faltering as he struggled to process the sudden shift in dynamic. The conversation that was supposed to be hers to lead was now slipping away, sliding into Daniel's hands with alarming ease. Daniel's response was calm, smooth, yet carried a weight that silenced those lingering nearby. Good to see you both again. I trust the foundation is thriving. The words were ordinary enough, but the way he said them, casual, assured, as though he were speaking not to potential clients but to longtime peers, left no doubt in anyone's mind. This was not a hired companion. This was someone who belonged here in ways Emma could not begin to explain. The Hartwells laughed softly, their guarded formality dissolving into warmth. Mrs. Hartwell touched Daniel's arm lightly, her eyes sparkling with recognition. Thriving, yes, though perhaps not as much as your ventures from what we hear. Emma felt the ground tilt beneath her. Ventures? Her mind spun, connecting fragments. His confidence, the whispers, the way heads turned at his presence. Whoever he was, Daniel wasn't just wealthy. He was someone whose name carried weight in circles she had only dreamed of entering. And yet, he had walked through her door 3 hours ago as if he were simply answering a discreet request from an agency. The contradiction burned in her chest, leaving her torn between anger, fear, and something far more dangerous: curiosity. Richard attempted to recover, clearing his throat and steering the conversation back to business. The Hartwells and I were just discussing their upcoming campaign, he said, his voice tighter than usual. But Emma noticed the way his eyes kept flicking toward Daniel, as though trying to solve a riddle he wasn't sure he wanted answered. For the first time in her career, Richard Hampton looked unsettled. The Hartwells, however, seemed to have lost interest in Richard's pitch. Their focus lingered on Daniel, asking him questions, laughing at his subtle remarks, leaning closer as though he were the true center of gravity in the room. And in a way, he was. Emma watched, torn between relief that their attention wasn't hostile and horror that her role in this evening was rapidly vanishing. She had worked tirelessly for this night, yet it was being rewritten in real time, reshaped by a man whose presence was rewriting all the rules. When the Hartwells were finally called away by another guest, Emma turned sharply toward Daniel, her emerald dress whispering as she moved. Her eyes blazed with a mixture of suspicion and desperation. "You need to tell me what's going on," she whispered, her voice low but fierce. "Who are you? Why do they know you?" Daniel met her gaze steadily, his expression as unreadable as ever, but his eyes carried a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, amusement perhaps, or maybe a warning. "Relax, Emma," he said softly, his voice smooth yet edged with finality. "You'll know soon enough." And then, with the ease of a man who had nothing to prove, he turned back toward the ballroom, leaving Emma standing breathless in his wake, her carefully planned evening collapsing into a mystery she could no longer control. Shifting power. The night deepened, and with it the atmosphere of the gala shifted in ways Emma could not ignore. The ballroom was alive with music from the string quartet, the laughter of polished guests, and the subtle hum of power flowing from one conversation to another. Yet no matter where Emma turned, the invisible current always seemed to bend back toward Daniel. It was as though the gala itself had rearranged its orbit around him, and she was left struggling to keep her balance. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she saw it clearly. The Hartwells had returned to him twice, brushing past her and Richard as though drawn back by some unspoken gravity. Other guests followed, curious at first, then eager to linger near him. A senator from Connecticut paused long enough to clasp his hand with startling familiarity. A young tech founder whispered something into his ear with the nervous eagerness of a man desperate for approval. Even the hotel's manager, who had been circling the room discreetly, came forward to greet him with a deferential smile. Emma felt a chill as realization crept over her. This wasn't random. This was recognition at the highest level. Richard Hampton noticed too, and it was unraveling him. Normally, the man exuded control, confident, brash, even arrogant when negotiating contracts, but tonight he seemed like a shadow of himself. His jaw was tight, his glass of champagne drained too quickly, and his attempts to steer conversations back toward business were interrupted repeatedly by the presence of Daniel. Each time Richard opened his mouth, someone else would interject with a comment directed at the mysterious man standing at Emma's side. The more Richard tried to assert himself, the more irrelevant he seemed. Emma had never seen her boss sidelined like this, and the sight filled her with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and dread. When the gala's master of ceremonies announced the start of the auction, a centerpiece of the evening, guests began to gather near the stage. Emma knew this was the Hartwells' favorite part of the night, the moment when fortunes were pledged under the glow of generosity and reputation. Richard leaned close to her as they moved with the crowd, his breath sharp with irritation. "Who is this man, Emma?" he hissed, his voice low enough for her alone. "Where did you find him?" He. Art lurched. She wanted to confess the truth, that she had panicked, that she had hired an escort, that she had no idea who this man really was, but the words froze in her throat. To admit that would mean destroying her credibility in front of the very people she needed to impress. Worse, it would expose her to Richard's scorn, and she knew he would use her mistake to ruin her chances of partnership forever. So she simply shook her head and muttered, "He's just here for the evening, that's all." Richard's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her. When the auction began, the energy in the room rose, and Daniel, to Emma's horror and fascination, became part of it without effort. A painting by a rising New York artist was unveiled, and bids began to climb rapidly. Emma expected him to stand back to let the wealthy donors compete while he played the role of silent arm candy. Instead, Daniel raised his hand casually, his voice calm as he placed a bid that silenced the room. The number was staggering. High enough to make jaws drop, high enough to shift every gaze toward him. And when a rival bidder attempted to outdo him, Daniel raised the price again, with no hesitation, no flicker of concern. The auctioneer nearly stumbled over his own words as the bids climbed beyond expectations. By the time the gavel fell, Daniel had secured the painting for a sum that exceeded the average annual budget of most charities. The room erupted in applause, the Hartwells smiling broadly, the auctioneer glowing with gratitude. Daniel accepted the attention with quiet composure, as though such gestures were nothing to him, as though dropping millions in a single evening was no more significant than buying a glass of wine. Emma's pulse thundered in her veins. Escorts did not spend fortunes at charity auctions. Escorts were paid for appearances, for company, for discretion, not for gestures that shifted the balance of an entire gala. Whoever Daniel was, he wasn't playing a role. He was living it. And everyone in the room knew it, except her, until tonight. Emma's heart lurched. She glanced at Daniel, waiting for him to deny it, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding. But he simply gave a small, knowing smile and excused himself with an ease that suggested he had lived this reality for years. The magnate nodded respectfully and moved on, leaving Emma breathless in the aftermath. The mask was cracking, piece by piece, and through it she was beginning to glimpse the truth. This man was no escort, no hired stranger. He was someone with real power, the kind that lived in shadows, the kind that shaped futures while remaining invisible. And yet, he had walked through her door when she had ordered someone to simply make her look less alone. As the evening wore on, the hints kept coming. A tech CEO thanked him for advice that had saved his company months earlier. A senator leaned in too close, whispering something about global influence before quickly retreating. Even the Hartwells themselves returned, their smiles brighter, their attention fixed on Daniel, as though Emma and Richard were afterthoughts. Richard's expression had grown darker by the hour, his jaw clenched tight, his pride cracking under the weight of being overshadowed. Emma, meanwhile, found herself spiraling deeper into confusion. She had built her career on reading people, on anticipating motives, on knowing the game before anyone else. But tonight she was in unfamiliar territory, standing beside a man whose identity was slipping through her grasp, no matter how tightly she tried to hold it. Every time she thought she had him cornered, he slipped away with a smile, leaving only more questions. By the time the gala neared its close, Emma's nerves were frayed, her thoughts tangled. She needed answers, desperately. But as Daniel escorted her out of the ballroom, his hand resting lightly against the small of her back, she realized with dawning dread that the answers would not come easily. Whoever he wasn't just here to play a role in her story, he was here to rewrite it. And Emma could no longer tell whether she had invited salvation into her life or ruin. The reveal. The limousine door closed with a quiet thud, sealing Emma and Daniel in a cocoon of leather seats and soft ambient light. Outside, the city roared with honking horns and flashing lights, but inside there was only silence, thick, charged, and unrelenting. Emma sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her emerald dress shimmering faintly each time the car passed beneath a streetlight. Hours of confusion, suspicion, and half-answers pressed down on her until she could no longer contain them. She turned toward him sharply, her voice trembling with both anger and desperation. Enough. No more evasions, no more cryptic remarks. Who are you really? Why were people whispering your name like it carried the weight of the world? Why do they look at you with fear and reverence? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back against the seat, his gaze fixed on the city skyline rushing past the tinted glass. For a long moment, Emma feared he would remain silent forever. Then, with a quiet exhale, he turned to her, his blue eyes steady and unflinching. "My name isn't Daniel," he said calmly, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had unsettled her all evening. "It's Alexander Grant." Emma blinked, confusion flooding her until, like a key clicking into a lock, the name snapped into place. Alexander Grant. She had read about him in the Financial Journal, seen his name whispered in industry reports, always attached to phrases like silent empire, anonymous investor, the ghost billionaire. He was the elusive CEO of Orion Capital, a firm so powerful it was rumored to control the fate of entire markets from the shadows. Few had ever seen him in public, and fewer still could claim to know him personally. For years he had been more myth than man, an untouchable figure whose wealth was measured not in millions, but in billions. Emma's breath caught in her throat. You're him," she whispered, the words trembling out of her lips. "The Alexander Grant?" A faint smile touched his mouth, not of arrogance, but of acknowledgement. "Yes." Emma's heart raced so fast she thought it might give out. Her mind reeled as she replayed the evening, the way heads had turned, the way the Hartwells had melted, the way Richard had withered under his presence. Suddenly it all made sense. He hadn't needed to pretend. He hadn't been playing the role of an escort. He had been a billionaire CEO walking quietly into her world, disguised not in costume, but in anonymity. And the most shocking truth of all, she had invited him. She pressed a hand to her forehead, shaking her head in disbelief. "But why? Why show up at my door? Why pretend to be someone you're not?" Alexander studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as though measuring the weight of his next words. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "I get tired of being seen only as the man with billions. People either fear me or flatter me, but they never see me. When your request crossed my desk," Emma's head snapped up. "You crossed your desk?" He gave a quiet chuckle. "The agency you contacted is one of my investments. I saw your name, saw the desperation between the lines of your request. Most would have ignored it, but something about it caught me. I wanted to see what kind of woman would risk her reputation for one night, for a chance at success. And now I know." Emma sat frozen, her thoughts spinning faster than she could catch them. Shame burned in her chest at the thought of him knowing how desperate she had been, how low she had stooped. But before she could drown in it, his voice cut through again, softer this time. "You're not weak, Emma. You're ambitious, relentless. You took a risk most wouldn't dare to take. That kind of courage, nourishes me." Her eyes flickered to his, stunned by the strange sincerity in his words. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander leaned closer, his gaze unyielding, his words deliberate. "Now you decide what to do with this. Tonight, you impressed the Hartwells not because of me, but because you carried yourself with grace even when you didn't know the truth. They'll remember you. Your boss will resent you, but he'll never underestimate you again. And as for me," his voice trailed for a moment, his smile faint but genuine. "I don't usually repeat encounters, but I think I'd like to see you again." Emma's chest tightened, caught between disbelief and a flicker of something dangerous. Hope. She had hired an escort to save her career, and instead she had crossed paths with a man whose power could reshape her world. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she realized the strangest truth of all. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was faking anything. She felt seen. The limousine slowed, pulling up in front of her apartment building. Emma hesitated, her fingers clutching her purse as though it were her only anchor to reality. She should have been terrified. She should have run from the enormity of what had just unfolded. But instead she found herself lingering, unwilling to break the moment. Alexander reached for her hand, his touch firm, yet gentle. "Think carefully, Emma," he said quietly. "You've stepped into a game far bigger than you imagined. The question is, are you ready to play it?" Emma's breath caught, her emerald dress whispering softly as she rose from the seat. She met his gaze one last time, her pulse racing with equal parts fear and exhilaration. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she stepped out of the car, the city air wrapping around her like a promise of change. As the limousine pulled away, Emma stood on the sidewalk staring after it, her mind echoing with his words. This was no longer about surviving one night. This was about everything. And Emma Chen, marketing director on the edge of breakthrough, realized her life would never be the same again.